Hello! Welcome to the final chapter of Saving the Unicorn's Horn. It's Saturday and I'm back today so that we get this finished off in a minute. Let me just get my feet up on the sofa. Yeah, I thought I'd come back. I think I said on the video yesterday I'd come back today and get this finished because it seems a bit of a shame to have the last chapter of a book hanging over across the whole weekend and come back on Monday to just one chapter. So when we get to Monday, we're going to start the next one in the series. So next up is Tudors. If you're enjoying this series, you found it either here or maybe on YouTube, because it's all on YouTube now. I do tell your friends. I'd love to have as many kids listening to this as possible, just to pass the time and what have you. So yeah, we've got one more chapter. I'm feeling actually quite sort of energetic today because we went out for a walk sort of this morning, late morning, me and my family, which we haven't actually done in a really, really long time, because we're lucky enough to have a decent sized garden and a trampoline, and so kids just don't really want to go out. We've been out on the bikes a little bit, a few times, not that often actually. But the children, we said, all right, we're going to go up to the bluebell woods that are near where we live. And the children kind of went, really? And then we went out and it was lovely. It was quiet. The birds were singing. There were wildflowers everywhere. There were bluebells. The beech trees were just bright, electric green. Absolutely beautiful. Which is what it's always like up there when we go up there. Because obviously we don't go unless it's beautiful weather. If it's miserable weather, we tend not to go out. So I just feel quite refreshed and pleased to have actually made the effort to go out, and it was really lovely. So yeah, so Saturday, here we are. Now let's have a look. We are right at the end of this book, as you'll know if you've listened to all the other episodes to get here. So Lucy and Jo have followed Thorbjorn across the sort of eventually snowy wasteland outside York. I got the impression when I was researching this that the countryside around York was probably really quite bleak at that time. Not at all built up. Obviously, you've got this walled city and then nothing for quite some distance around. So they've ridden back across this wasteland outside of York and had to cross the river in order to get into the city because the city gates are closed. But they realise as they approach Lucy's house that they were right, and Thorbjorn is there because Lucy's family's horse, which Thorbjorn had stolen, is tethered outside. So they've tethered their horse a bit down the street and they've walked just the last little bit. They've walked back rather than riding because they were so cold that their legs and feet were completely numb. So there we are. Okay. And yeah, now they've just ventured into the house. They have nothing in terms of a weapon except for Lucy's knife and the element of surprise. And she says to him, I'm more used to feeling my way around inside. It's going to be dark, pitch dark without the fire. I'm more used to feeling my way around in there. I'll go first. And she turned back towards the house and pushed the door open. Chapter 16. The first thing that struck Jo, as he peered over Lucy's shoulder, was that the room beyond wasn't completely dark. Tiny flickering lights glowed in 3 different places. He frowned. One came from a small heap of curled wood shavings on the hearth where the fire would usually be. But the other 2 were along the bottom of the walls. It was freezing, but there was a bitter smell in the air. The room was even more bare than usual. For a moment, Jo thought that Thorbjorn had decided to steal much more than just the horse. Then he remembered that the cooking pot and its frame and the cloths which usually hung on the walls were all in the tent back at the encampment. So too were the fleeces for the earth sleeping benches and the trestle table. Lucy stood motionless. At the far end of the room, Thorbjorn was crouching beside the back wall, hunched over something they couldn't see. He seemed not to have heard them open the door. Joe touched Lucy's arm. She turned her head. "What's he doing?" he mouthed. She shook her head and made a face to say she didn't know. Then she pointed. On one of the earth benches lay a long, twisted stick with a sharp point at one end. It did look like how you would imagine a unicorn's horn, Joe thought. Although the exchange between them had passed without a sound, Thorbjorn glanced over his shoulder. In a flash, he sprang to his feet and whipped round to face them. His shadow leapt up on the wall behind him, towering monstrously over them all. A small flame flickered behind his feet. "You too," he snarled. "I should have known you'd turn up again." He advanced a few paces towards them. "Unbelievable." His eyes were narrow. "There's not another soul in the whole of Jorvik, but here we all are together. What are the chances of that?" "What are you doing in our house?" asked through her teeth. She took a step into the room, her knife clasped tightly in her fist, which was hidden behind her cloak. "Me? I've come for what's rightfully mine." His gaze flitted to the bench where the horn lay, and then back to Lucy. "That's right." He laughed grimly, relishing the expression on her face. "The horn that your uncle stole when he slaughtered my father." "He did not!" Lucy cried. "That's been in our family for generations." "Oh, yes? Is that what your father told you?" She ignored his taunt and took another step forward. "How did you find it?" The older boy smiled sweetly. "I looked for it when I came in to see to your dogs." Joe saw Lucy's shoulders tense in front of him. "I couldn't find it anywhere, so I thought perhaps you kept it somewhere else, away from the house. I did find this chest, though it was locked then." Thorbjorn looked down at the open lid of the box sunk in the ground beside his feet. "And the very next day I heard you and your friend talking about the horn in the street. That was careless, don't you think? So I knew it must be in here. After that, it was just a matter of waiting for the right moment to steal the keys from your mother." He looked so pleased with him, Joe wanted to punch him. "She led me a merry dance this evening, I must say." Thorbjorn chuckled without mirth. "But I was patient, like a good boy, and this was my reward." He gestured grandly at the chest. "I must admit, I was rather disappointed by how little else of value is in there. I was hoping there might be enough to pay my way to Dublin, without starting to shave the end off the precious horn." He shrugged. "The silver plate will cover some of it, I suppose. The rest is barely worth the effort of carrying it." "How dare you!" Lucy screeched. "Those are my family's treasures." All of a sudden she flew at him, her knife held out in front of her. Thorbjorn's hand went to his belt, but his own knife wasn't there. Surprise flashed across his face. Then he reached out and knocked Lucy's knife from her hand. Before she could bend to pick it up, he caught hold of her wrist and twisted her arm behind her back. She yelped. He caught hold of her other arm and pulled her roughly in front of him, holding her like a shield. Then in one fluid movement he stepped sideways and seized the horn. He spun it round. The sharp point came up beneath her jaw. "You move a muscle," he growled at Joe, "and I'll stab this into her throat so she bleeds like a stuck pig." Standing in the doorway, Joe tried desperately to think what to do. Lucy's knife was on the ground, but he doubted it would be much use, even if he could get it. Aileen had taken with her any knives she might use for cutting meat, and he could see Thorbjorn's knife down on the floor beside the back wall, well out of reach. In the meantime, the tiny lights along the walls had grown into knee-high flames, licking their way up the wattle. The air was filled with vile-smelling smoke. He quailed inwardly. There was no time to lose. Yet if he made a mistake, Lucy's prophecy about the unicorn's horn would come true. Thorbjorn would take it, leaving Lucy bleeding to death in a house which was burning down. Joe took a deep breath. He had only one weapon, Thorbjorn's uncertainty. Just now he couldn't see how to make use of it, but he had to do something. He spread out his hands in front of him as though to show that he meant no harm. "Why are you doing that, Thorbjorn?" he asked, playing for time. "It's not her you want, is it? It's me. We both know that." In the flickering light he thought he saw confusion in the other boy's face. "Twice you've nearly done it," he said, hoping to sound encouraging. "Yes," Thorbjorn snapped, "and both times you've got away by some witchery or magic." Watching him, Joe realised with a small thrill that it wasn't confusion in Thorbjorn's eyes. It was fear. Thorbjorn shifted his grip on Lucy. She stifled a sob. "If I let her go," he snarled, "and take you as my hostage, how do I know you won't banish again?" Joe nodded in agreement. He didn't know either. Thorbjorn moved the point of the horn around Lucy's neck. She choked. The horn had caught on the chain of the St. Christopher. "What's this?" He leaned round from behind to look at her throat. Neither of them answered. "Well, what is it?" Thorbjorn gave a little jab with the tip of the horn. Lucy cried out. "It's a lucky charm," Joe said quickly. "Not so lucky now, is it?" Thorbjorn prized the chain away from her throat, and then with a flick of the horn snapped it. The St. Christopher skittered away across the floor towards the doorway. Joe watched it. More than anything, he wanted to pick it up. The sight of it rolling along the ground reminded him overwhelmingly of home, or at least of being in York in his own time. But if he touched it, he might be whisked back into his own world, leaving Lucy at Thorbjorn's mercy. "Joe gave it to me," Lucy said, biting back tears. Excuse me. Hang on a minute. I just realised I didn't tell my phone to not interrupt me. There we are. "Joe gave it to me," Lucy said, biting back tears. "It was to protect me when he wasn't with me." "How sweet. But now that he is, you don't need it, is that what you're saying?" At that moment, inspiration tumbled into Joe's mind. "That's right," he said from the doorway, still not moving. "It calls me to her, from wherever I am. You know already I can travel through time and space, just as I like, and when she wears that, I can take her with me." He leaned on the doorframe, pretending that he was calm and that his heart wasn't pounding in his chest. This had to work, he thought fiercely. It had to. "How do you think we came to be here at the same time as you?" he asked. Thorbjorn didn't reply. "Now that you've broken the chain," Lucy went on, "I can't take her out of your grip." He smiled at Lucy, hoping to convey to her a confidence that he didn't feel. "But I can pick it up and use it to fetch Loki." He paused to let Thorbjorn think about this. "Let's just say," he continued, "that I bend down to pick it up. If you carry out your threat and drive the horn into her neck, I'll be back here with Loki in just a few seconds." He watched Thorbjorn's face carefully. "Do you think he'll spare your life when he sees you've killed his daughter?" Thorbjorn's eyes widened. "Of course not." Joe answered his own question. "He's a warrior. You'll be lucky if he gives you time to beg for mercy before he cuts your head off." He had barely finished speaking before Thorbjorn thrust Lucy away from him. He flung himself towards the doorway where Joe stood. Joe staggered backwards and fell. Instinctively, he grabbed hold of Thorbjorn's cloak and locked his legs around the other boy. The horn was trapped between them. Its twisted edge ground painfully against Joe's ribs. He clenched every muscle, determined not to let Thorbjorn escape. The two boys rolled over and over, wrestling in the doorway for what seemed like an eternity. Then there was a crack. Joe felt a searing pain in his side. For a split second, he loosened his hold on the older boy. Thorbjorn seized his chance and threw himself over Joe and out into the street, still on his hands and knees. He scrabbled to his feet and lunged again at the doorway, grasping for the two pieces of horn that lay on the ground. Summoning all his strength, Joe struck out with his foot, shoving Thorbjorn backwards. The other boy slipped, struggled to keep his balance in the snow, and then fell. Joe snatched the part of the horn with the sharp end. He lurched up onto his knees, brandishing it at Thorbjorn. The older boy shimmied away like a crab making for a rock. Then he got slowly to his feet without taking his eyes off Joe. For a few seconds he stood, tense and motionless, as though about to pounce again. Suddenly the silence was broken by the dull thudding of hooves galloping through the snow towards them. Thorbjorn turned his head sharply and listened. Then he sprang away and up onto the back of the horse he'd left tethered by the house. He wrenched the rope free, screeching and beating the animal. The horse screamed and rose up on its hind legs. Thorbjorn clung on. Then it fled down the street with him still astride it, away from the sound of the oncoming hooves. Joe slumped down in the doorway of Lucy's house. Something really hurt in his side. "Are you all right?" Lucy's face looked down at him. "I think so," he muttered. "What about the fire? We need to do something before the whole house catches light." Before she could answer, a huge horse, bigger even than the one they had ridden, came thundering down the street towards him. It reared up above their heads as it halted. Lockie jumped down. "Joe? Luishag, what in the name of Valhalla are you doing here?" Lucy ran forward and threw her arms around her father. "You came. How did you know? Oh, Father, Joe was so brave. But Thorbjorn has taken our horse." Joe looked down at the pieces of horn. The one in his hand had blood on the snapped end. "I'm sorry," he said. "Your horn got broken. I know it was very valuable." He waited to see if Lockie was going to be angry. He felt weak. "Thorbjorn has been trying to burn the house down," Lucy cried. "I put out 2 of the fires with my cloak. I know it was new, but there were no buckets and no water." She pushed away from him. "There's one more I must put out." Lockie shook his head in wonder as she disappeared into the house again. He stooped to Joe. "That's a nasty gash you've got there, boy." Joe winced as Lockie lifted the material of his tunic and undershirt away from his skin. He looked down. A red rose of blood had spread through them from a deep wound in his side. "I'm going to pack that with snow to stop the bleeding." Lucy's father had scooped up a handful of icy crystals and pressed them into the cut before Joe could even speak. He bit down hard on the edge of his tongue to stop himself from shouting out. "Now then, let's get inside, and then you can tell me what on earth has happened here." Lockie bent down and picked up the second piece of the horn from the ground. "At least this will fit more easily into the chest now." His eyes twinkled. He helped Joe to his feet and into the house. Lucy had put out the fires around the walls, but the flames Thorbjorn had conjured on the hearth leapt higher now. Lucy bent over them, feeding them with kindling from a basket. As she worked, she told her father how they had seen Thorbjorn leaving the encampment, how they had taken someone else's horse and ridden through the night and found the gates closed and then crossed the icy river. Finally, she told him what had happened when they arrived here. Loki sat on the stool, warming his hands at the fire and listening while he looked around the room. The ragged ends of burned willow still smoked around the holes in the walls, and the planks lay askew across the floor where Thorbjorn had kicked them aside to uncover the chest in the ground. He'd obviously planned it carefully, Loki said at last, even setting light to the house. He must have realized there would be no fire anywhere, and brought a fire steel with him specially. He scratched his chin. It's quite different from what I feared, you know. I owe you both a huge debt, especially you, Joe. What did you think had happened? Lucy asked. Well, your mother discovered her keys were gone. She hoped they'd fallen off back at the tent. But when she and Matthias went to fetch the shovels for the burial, they found that you children and the horse had gone too. Matthias came running back to tell me. He rubbed his forehead. I feel ashamed now, but I thought it must be you, Joe. I thought perhaps you had killed the dogs somehow, since they were so afraid of you. And now you'd stolen Aileen's keys, taken my daughter, and used my horse to ride back here and steal the narwhal horn. Narwhal? Lucy looked up, stricken. So Joe was right. It's not from a unicorn. What about the curse? What curse? Lucy chanted the words she'd recited to Joe. Loki grinned broadly. Who told you that? Your older brother? You don't want to believe everything he says. We'd say the horn was from a unicorn if we traded with it abroad. That's what makes it so valuable, you see. But any seafarer worth his salt knows it comes from the Arctic waters. The prophecy is obviously Matthias's little joke. Now then, don't look so crestfallen. He reached out and stroked her arm. Anyway, I borrowed the fastest horse I could and followed you back. I had to cross the river too, just like you. He looked down absent-mindedly at his sodden boots. Don't you want to go after Thorbjorn? Joe asked after a few moments. He left less than a minute before you got here. You'd catch him up easily. Did he say where he was going? Dublin, I think. He wanted to use the horn to pay his way. Loki shrugged. He's got the horse, I suppose, but that won't get him far. All the same, I doubt he'll come back here, because he knows he'll be punished for the theft and the fire. He looked ruefully at the smoke in the air. You know, I think I'd prefer it if I never saw him again, rather than haul him back to face his punishment. That will only stoke his fury and his desire for revenge. Lucy looked at the two pieces of horn between Loki's feet. Did my uncle steal the horn from Thorbjorn's father when he killed him? That's what Thorbjorn said. Loki picked up the pieces and turned them round in his hands. No, my father definitely had it when I was a child. He fitted the pieces together. I'll repair it if I can. Then maybe I'll borrow Cousin Finwith's horse and ride out of the Danelaw when the better weather comes. I'm sure I can sell some of the powder to those scruffy people further south. They'll believe it's from a unicorn, so I should make enough to pay for the repairs to the house and a new horse for us. Lucy straightened up and went to pick up St. Christopher from the floor. I'm sorry the chain got broken, she said, holding it out to Joe. But I think it did its job, keeping me safe. It's time for you to have it back. Joe hesitated. He didn't know whether the St. Christopher would take him home or whether he wanted to go. Part of him yearned to be warm and dry again and to be rid of the pain in his side. But another part wanted to see the rest of Lucy's family return, to enjoy a few moments of glory, and to be here still when they'd sold some of the horn and mended their house. Perhaps they might even spend some of the money on a few luxuries to make their lives a little less hard. He hoped so. Lucy smiled at him. You did say you wanted it back in the end. Here, take it. Slowly, Joe stretched out his hand. As his fingers closed over the little silver disc, the familiar rushing sound filled his ears. By the way, he heard Lucy say, was it true, what you told Thorbjorn about using it to carry people with you through time? Her voice seemed to come from a great distance. He shook his head and grinned, but the dizziness was suddenly too much. He shook his head again, harder this time, trying to stop it. He couldn't. He grasped around with his hands for something to hold on to. He hadn't said goodbye to her. He wasn't ready. Just a minute more. Are you all right, Joe? His head was swimming. He tried to focus. His teacher was standing at the front of the classroom, her pen in her hand. She was looking at him strangely. Yes, thanks. I'm fine, he mumbled, and promptly fainted onto his desk. It's not like you to pass out like that, his mother said, as she patted the duvet down around him back at home half an hour later. Is that what happened with Dad on York Station? I don't know, Joe said truthfully. Well, we'll take you to see the doctor as soon as I can get an appointment. She stood up. I'll be back up in a minute with a drink for you. Joe snuggled down beneath the covers. It was wonderful to be somewhere warm and comfortable again. He knew there was nothing wrong with him, except that he was really as tired as if he'd been up all night. He waited until he could hear Mum in the kitchen, then pulled up his pyjama top and peered under the duvet at the place on his side where the horn had stabbed him. As he'd guessed, there was no blood and no scab, but he could just make out a very faint V shape on his skin where scar tissue had formed. He pulled his top down again and settled back on his pillows, satisfied. The St. Christopher was still in the pocket of his trousers. He'd managed to hide it before Mum saw it. All he had to do now was find a way of buying another new chain. In fact, perhaps he should buy two, just in case it got broken again next time he was in Lucy's world. Next time. He closed his eyes. Where would that be? Not Jorvik, he was fairly sure. He might not have said goodbye to her, but he had a feeling that his time there was over. Clearly it wouldn't be Fishbourne either. He wondered idly about going to the library to see what bit of history came next after the Vikings. Then he decided that he wouldn't. There wasn't much point really, since he didn't know how many hundreds of years he would have to skip to get to the right time. For now, anyway, it was good just to be home for a bit. His own world was so much easier to live in than hers. And when the chance did come to slip into another time again, it would be a nice surprise. It would be hard work, he knew that now, and probably quite dangerous, but at least it would be an adventure. Of that, he was absolutely certain. The end. The end. I hope you enjoyed that book. I quite enjoyed rereading it. Like I say, it's been a long time since I last did. Viking times are very interesting. I found the book quite difficult to write because you have to imagine such a lot to fill the gaps, because they didn't write anything down. Like I was saying yesterday about runes, they didn't write anything down. And so what we've reconstructed, what we know about how they worked, is to do with how they lived, is to do with finding things like old shoes and old knives and combs and the outlines of their houses and all that sort of thing. So I did have to really work my imagination to fill the gaps. But it was interesting. It was interesting. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you want any more information about the series, as you probably already know, it's here. There we are. And on Monday, I'm going to start the next book, the third book in the series. So it's Goodbye to the Tudors, Goodbye to the Vikings, and Hello to the Tudors. The Falconer Squire, this is called. You need to get your mirror out to read that. So this is set in the year of the Mary Rose sinking, which is 1540. I think that's right. So it's Henry VIII is on the throne. It's quite different. Lucy lives somewhere very different this next time. But in so many ways it's quite similar because it's the same people. So yeah, I'm kind of looking forward to that, and I hope you are too, and I hope you'll join me. And yes, if you like these videos, tell your friends so that more children get to watch them and pass the time. All right, I wish you a very nice weekend, a good Saturday evening and a nice Sunday, and I will see you again on Monday.